big stuff to do right off the bat. I mean, people say it's always big stuff off the bat, but the budget is like the biggest of the big.
Yeah. I mean, you're right. It's going to be, the devil is always in the details. The clock has already started. I mean, this is not we're walking in and the clock starts. Like, it is clear that the clock has already started.
From the Defense and Aerospace Report, this is The Downlink, a podcast about the intersection of space, the space business, and defense. Not just what's over the horizon, but what's happening above it. I'm your host, Laura Winter. Hey there, folks. We are now just days away from President-elect Donald Trump's second inauguration. That's on Monday. And that's also when the clock starts for what's called the first 100 days, or honeymoon period. It's a measuring stick of sorts that has been used to appraise the progress of presidents since Franklin Roosevelt in 1933. This episode is about what this second Trump administration and the 119th Congress should get done and how for space and security in these first 100 days. And for that, we have Todd Harrison and Sarah Mineiro. Both are experts on space and defense policy and how stuff works and gets done. But before we hear from them, there is a bit of news that must be marked, and that is Trump's pick to lead the Department of the Air Force. He's space-minded. Trump has tapped Troy Meink to become the 27th Secretary of the Air Force. That department oversees the Air Force and the Space Force. Meink is currently the Principal Deputy Director for the National Reconnaissance Office, or NRO. That organization is part of the intelligence community and uses space systems for its mission, which is to see, hear, and sense threats around the world in real time. Meink has been in the number 2 leadership position since 2020. Meink joined the Air Force in 1988 and became a KC-135 tanker navigator and instructor. So he's air-minded as well. But what we're concerned with is his space bona fides, and he's got deep experience that dates back to at least 2001 when he became a chief technical advisor at the Air Force Research Laboratory's Space Vehicles Directorate in New Mexico. Since then, his resume is all space, including an 8-month stint as Undersecretary of the Air Force for Space. Trump announced Mike's nomination after this week's episode was recorded. But what we're talking about this week is pretty key to Mike's success. So here's our conversation with Todd and Sarah. Hey, Todd, it's great to have you back on the podcast. And Sarah, I am so happy you are here because it has been way too long. Both of you, welcome back.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me back.
So before we begin our conversation, let's take a minute. Please briefly introduce yourselves. Todd, kick us off.
Sure. I'm Todd Harrison. I'm a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, previously CSIS, CSBA, and out in the defense industry.
And Sarah, it has been a while since you've been on the podcast, and I really want the audience to get a good update on what you're doing and where. So take 2 moments.
Thanks. I'm Sarah Mineiro. I'm a space nerd, have been for about 20 years now. I've taken my space nerdiness out on my own, and I now own a consulting business helping companies try to match and speak the language of kind of their financiers, their business back end, but also the Defense Department and sometimes the Hill.
So, as you both know, I've brought you together to discuss the first 100 days of this second, but not consecutive presidential term in space policy and national security. There's a lot to do. And this beginning of an administration, while not unique, is very rare in U.S. history for both the executive branch and the legislative. So, Todd, I think it'd be really helpful for everyone listening if you give us the particular governance elements that make the beginnings of this 47th administration a rarity. so we can then better understand the context of the challenges. Todd?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, just to kind of emphasize the obvious here, right? What's unusual is you have an administration that was in power for 4 years. Normally, if you enact policies or put things in motion in the first term, then you can continue to work those things in your second term. But then, 8 years in the future, you're long gone. What's different here is, they had their first 4 years and then a break of 4 years where a different administration had the helm. And then now they're picking back up. Now, when it comes to space and space policy, the Biden administration continued a lot of things that the Trump administration had put in place, and really didn't change that much. So now the Trump administration is coming in, 8 years after it began, and they're inheriting some of what the seeds that they planted, right? And now they've got to think, oh, what is next beyond this? What course corrections are now needed to keep things moving in the direction that they had originally envisioned? So it is a bit different than a typical transition.
And isn't it also a lame duck presidency? And
Of course,
that kind of makes things even a bit stranger.
it is, because obviously, Trump is, not going to be allowed to run for another term of office. I don't think the lame duck mindset is going to sink in just yet. I think really he's got the first 2 years while, his party controls the House, his party controls the Senate. But then the last 2 years of administration, his administration, I think, is where the lame duck thinking is really going to set in heavily, because typically presidents, do not do well. Their party doesn't do well in a midterm election, just historically. They've already got a razor thin majority in the House.
What's it like, two people or something like that?
Yeah. I mean, depending on who's been sworn in at this moment. But, so there's a good chance that the House will flip in the next election. Less likely that the Senate will flip, but that means they only really have 2 years to get a lot done. And even then, next year, folks are already going to be campaigning for the midterms, right? So really, it's 1 year that they have this window of opportunity to push through as much as they can. And then you got to ask yourself, well, how does space rank in the pecking order of all of the political and policy priorities that they've got in this new administration? Because they know the window. They know that time is precious, how much space policy and changes in space programs are going to make it into that in the next year.
And another thing that also makes this pretty darn rare, isn't it? And Sarah, correct me if I'm wrong, right, is the fact that the 2025 budget, this year's budget for the national government, has not been passed prior to the new incoming administration coming in. Now, I am not a historian. I'm not a congressional historian. I'm not a national budget historian. That I definitely leave to you, Todd. This is different. That means that this incoming administration really does have quite a bit of power. And yet there is also a time limit, at least. The continuing resolution that enables the government to stay open without a national budget having been passed into law for this year of 2025, the money runs out on March 14th, right? So I'm kind of wondering, Sarah, and this really goes to your time on the Hill, and because, again, I think our listeners really need a baseline on just what are the tools that the administration has at its disposal for these first 100 days. The president, incoming, Trump, it's been reported that he has more than 100 executive orders lined up. But what are the tools for getting things done when there's such a razor-thin majority in the House of Representatives and there is such big stuff to do right off the bat? I mean, people say it's always big stuff off the bat, but the budget is like the biggest of the big.
Yeah. I mean, you're right. It's going to be, the devil is always in the details. The clock has already started. I mean, this is not, we're walking in and the clock starts. Like, it is clear that the clock has already started. Um, I think one of the great things about how you frame this discussion is I think a lot of people think that this is all about President Trump and what he's able to accomplish in the first 100 days. There are other co-equal branches of government that have, quite frankly, a large say in whether and how he will be able to implement his agenda. And none of the parties, whether Republican or Democrat, in either chamber are a monolith, right? All of these people are elected to be able to represent their constituents. They have legitimate interest in doing that, and also serving in their committee capacity and as legislators to the best of their ability and to their conscience. And so that is going to be fascinating to see. We've already seen some of this unfold, and I should probably just state now that I do not represent or speak for any administration or party or committee. I barely speak for myself on good days. Let me say, though, that there are several tools that both the executive branch and the legislative branch have, right? And these are not necessarily just binary. And so I know everybody, just wants a binary yes or no. The reality is that this is much more nuanced. And so a lot of these are not necessarily just mutually exclusive options. So on the executive branch side, clearly they have the ability to relook at the 25 budget with the new priorities of the incoming administration and make adjustments there. That happens all internally to the executive agencies and departments, and so they can kick back that budget. Right?
Do you
and
think
it's literally called a kickback, where they will go ahead and look at what that programmatic budget was anticipated to be, what that request was supposed to be, and then send that back to the departments and agencies if there's things that they don't agree with or that they'd like adjustments to.
Let me jump in real quick. So
Yes,
then
ma'am.
are you saying that we could actually expect a presidential budget request in kind of like the way that we sort of kind of get around February, March time?
I think that if one happens, it'll happen in March. And then, you have to recognize that the executive branch is, and specifically when we're talking about the Department of Defense, is always executing 3 different budgets. Right? They're either executing or planning for, programming for 3 different budgets. And it's a very complicated dance. So one is clearly the request, right? The budget request. What happens with that budget request? And, the interesting thing with that budget request is that it is a request, right? And so it does need to be sent over to the legislative branch that then has a significant say in what happens there, both the authorizers and the appropriators. So that's one lever that also extends over to the legislative branch. The other that you've mentioned is executive orders, right? And the executive orders come directly from the president. The first executive order that's generally let out is about the establishment of the NSC and how they're going to run that process and what that looks like. The National Security Advisor has already been named, Representative Waltz. He, interestingly enough, is very interested in space stuff, right? I mean, he actually represents a district that is home to Embry-Riddle University, which pumps out just a tremendous amount of great engineering students. He has served on the House Armed Services Strategic Forces Committee. He understands those issues and that issue set. And so, that will be interesting to see what comes out of the actual executive office of the president, and how that will work. There's a tremendous amount of authority that's granted to the president to be able to make executive orders that don't actually need to be passed into law, right? And so there's a lot of work there within the departments and agencies, guidance, and policies that can come out there. Of the kind of National Space Council stuff that comes out, right, is at that same level of an executive branch kind of decree or order that does not have to be passed and made into law. And so those are the two big levers that they have. Clearly, Congress is going to roll in. They receive the president's budget request, and then they go through and do their own cycle. That will be impacted, of course, by debt ceiling negotiations, by the final appropriation and the resolution and reconciliation of 25, and their own legislative agenda that's going to be pursued by the members and senators of the House and the Senate.
Well, yeah, actually, I have to admit to both of you here and everybody else out there that the 2023 Fiscal Responsibility Act is more than a little confusing to me in this context. But I also know that this is actually part of the mix. So, Todd, do me a kindness and very briefly explain how this law, which was championed by Trump's party and many of the folks that currently are sitting in Congress, doesn't this actually just complicate everything else further? And just to throw one more little wrench into the works, last Friday in the Washington Round Table for the Defense and Aerospace Report, which is the umbrella flagship podcast of the Defense and Aerospace Report, right? Michael Herson said that there's actually even talk now of even passing another continuing resolution. So if that happens, that does mean that the 2023 Fiscal Responsibility Act could really come into play. So could you explain that? Sorry, but I actually find it really confusing.
Yeah. So what the FRA, Fiscal Responsibility Act, did is it resurrected budget caps for defense and non-defense parts of the discretionary budget. So you can't go above a certain cap. Those caps apply to fiscal year 24 and fiscal year 25. There's penalty built in. If you exceed the cap, you get sequestered. That's an automatic cut that brings you down to the cap level. And if any part of government is on a continuing resolution extending through April, then there's a penalty and the caps are lowered. But as soon as all parts of government receive regular appropriations, the penalty is reversed. So it's a temporary penalty. I wouldn't pay too much attention to it because it's a very unlikely edge case that penalty would actually remain in effect permanently, because that means that, Congress would have to deliberately not pass appropriations. The big thing about the FRA is that it caps the budget for fiscal year 2025. And the Biden administration, they submitted their budget request for defense at the cap level. And that's already what the House has marked up their bill to. The Senate wants to exceed the cap. And so that's one of the things that they have to work out. The problem is, if you want to exceed the cap, you've got to either change the FRA, the original law, or you've got to use one of the loopholes available to you. One of the loopholes is just declare it to be emergency supplemental funding, regardless of what it is. And then it doesn't count towards your budget cap, right? So you can put a little extra money in there, say it's emergency supplemental, and you're fine. But everyone knows the game. And so you've got the fiscal conservatives, particularly in the Freedom Caucus in the House, who are likely to put the brakes on any effort to do that.
So we have the outline of what's going to challenge the new Trump administration. Let's apply that to the space domain, right? This is the one area that Trump has a real legacy to protect and nurture. Plus, it's critical to national security. We have to remember that it was under his first administration that he not only established the Space Force, he also signed off on the United States leading a coalition of the like-minded for a return to the moon, to build a permanent human presence there, establish a space and cislunar economy, all to build a jump-off point for getting to Mars, which, as we have heard, is really a high priority for his new bestie, Elon Musk, who desperately wants to go to Mars. He will do everything and has said as such. So, he's living up to what he's billed himself as. All of this fiscal and policy churn seems to threaten progress, though, and national security. So let's get after that. At a mere 3% of the defense budget, 29 billion roughly, that was from the 2024 budget for Space Force, experts have come on this podcast to say that Space Force budget just isn't enough to cover down on the growing mission set. Even the chief of space operations, General Chance Saltzman, has begun explicitly, that really is new, saying it's not enough, from personnel to science and technology development to procurement. Defense of the homeland and the nation's interests should be the number one job of any administration. So, what should be the Trump's space and defense priorities in the first 100 days? And which tools does he use to get it done? He and his administration, to be fair.
All right, I'll take a stab at this. I'll bite at this one for you. First 100 days in on the national security front are going to look like confirmations and nominations. You've already started to see that. Again, this testifies to the fact that they recognize that their timeline has already started, right? They're out of the gate. For drilling down into space, clearly there's been a NASA administrator that has been nominated. There has not even been a SecAF nominee publicly put out there yet, right? And right now, the Space Force is still a part of the Department of the Air Force. And so a lot of those political appointees that come under that Secretary of the Air Force that impact space, the Undersecretary of the Air Force, which is usually has a pretty strong hand in the budget request development. Certainly the service acquisition executives for both air and space, right? Both Senate confirmed. Neither of those have been announced or nominated. Probably won't be until the Secretary of the Air Force is nominated, because they probably want to have existing relationships there, which is understandable. So again, people, getting the correct people in that are going to be able to drill down and implement the president's budget and his policy priorities in the first 100 days is going to be really challenging and essential. And I think you're going to start to see that with the line of budget confirmation hearings that are starting this week. The second is relooking at the budget, again, acknowledging the challenges and opportunities that FY25 has, because it has not been, fiscal year 25 has not, the final appropriation has not been passed. And so you've got the departments and the agencies working under a proportion of the budget that they've had for projected out for the past at least couple of months. That does not allow them to make new programs, to, go out and be tremendously innovative or creative on the budgeting or the programmatic side. What it does do, and what I think you will see in the first kind of 100 days, is a lot of emphasis on how you can do more with less. This is not, I think, in an era where people are going to come in, and I know I may be in the minority here. I'm used to being in the minority opinion, but I don't think that there's going to be a tremendous budget increase. I think if they're, and primarily because of what Todd talked about, you have to really think about pay for, you have to think about, how you're getting this money, you have to think about existing within those caps. And if you're going to do that, then you've got to make trades, right? You've got to be more efficient. Even the most, defense hawks and people that want to increase the budget aren't saying increase the defense budget blindly, right? They're saying there are specific capabilities that require resources, and we should prioritize them. So that first 100 days is going to be about prioritizing and efficiency, and driving that through the 25 budget closeout, but also really looking at 26 going forward to say, where can we find better efficiency? Where can we, if we're not going to get a tremendous top line increase, what are the missions that we can look to commercial to help us more with? What are the missions that we could look to the intelligence community to help us more with? What are the missions that we could look to NASA to help us with, to NOAA, to Office of Space Commerce, right? and thinking about that in a more whole of government perspective, but also in a more, quite frankly, just efficient way of looking at a relatively stable resource allocation. And so while I think that CSS Saltzman is out there doing God's work and saying some very obvious things, which is, you know, space is really the foundation for a tremendous amount, if not all, of our joint force power projection, and it deserves to be resourced as such. While I acknowledge that, I think that's going to be really hard to figure out how to do in a limited budget constrained environment. And when you look at the nuclear deterrent modernization, they say that that's what, 8% of the budget? 7 to 8% is typically. If you look at the entire modernization of the nuclear weapons enterprise, including the nuclear command and control enterprise, at 7 to 8%, space at percent, is that appropriate? I think there's reason to have that discussion, and reasonable people can do that.
Well, let's continue with that discussion and capabilities. And Todd, this is going to go into what I think you want to say. So be patient with me, right? Because what's required for deterrence in the space domain? Because that's what we're really talking about when we're talking about securing things for the nation, securing things for the war fighters of the other domain, securing, those sort of things requires a form of deterrence of some kind in the space domain. And here's an example that is less than 2 weeks old that I really hope serves as a bit of a wake up, right? Because all this churn means that, things get missed. But less than 2 weeks ago, the South China Morning Post reported on January 2nd that the Changguang satellite technology company's Jilin-1 satellite has used lasers to achieve a data transmission speed of 100 gigabytes a second, allegedly, right? And that's allegedly faster than Starlink. And this Chinese company, Changguang, was created by the Chinese Academy of Sciences, the Changchun Institute of Optics, and the Jilin government. But most importantly, it received some of its seed capital from what was then the People's Liberation Army's Strategic Support Force, aka the Space Force, which is now called the Chinese Aerospace Forces, right? But the Jilin constellation is designed for Earth observation and reportedly tracked an F-22 last summer. There is video. So higher data transmission speeds may give Chinese commanders and warfighters an edge in a real-world fight, right? This isn't like sort of hearsay when we talk about capabilities, or just like what Sarah said, the CSO is doing God's work and saying, hey, we really need stuff, but we also have efficiencies and budgets and all that. How do we get this into such a way, or rather maybe what should the administration and Congress be thinking about in terms of really creating a credible deterrence in the space domain? Todd?
Well, yeah, I would say, first thing they got to remember is weakness invites aggression, right? And if we're weak, if we're vulnerable in space, that actually makes a conflict beginning or extending into space more likely. So we've got to get over this notion that, if we deploy space weapons, however you want to define that, or if we're building out more resilient space systems, if we're preparing for a war in space, that somehow that makes it more likely. No, not preparing is what makes it more likely. And I think we've turned that corner in the policy debate for the most part, but you never know. You have to keep re-educating people. And to Sarah's point, I take your point, right? That there's not more money flowing around, and it's not likely that the spigot of spending is suddenly going to turn on and the Space Force will be able to get everything it needs. I think it is possible, though, that the Space Force could take budget share. Even if the budget is flat, I think it can, and I think it probably should be taking budget share, if not from Mother Air Force, from the other services. And it's just about, a matter of prioritization. And I think what has to accompany taking budget share is taking mission share. And you've got to show that the Space Force is actually doing more missions and doing them better from space than those same missions were being done in other domains. And so that's where I look for this administration, not within the first 100 days, but over the first couple of years, to really get moving on things like the military's own synthetic aperture radar satellite constellation that can do moving target indication, ground moving target, airborne moving target, maritime moving target. We need to be able to do all of that from space 24/7, the entire globe, high capacity, of targets that we can track at once. The technology exists. Why don't we have that, right? And yes, they have a program that General Raymond, I think he first talked about this program back in 2021. And after 3 years, in August of 2024, I believe, they finally got to milestone B. And for people who aren't familiar with the acquisition process, milestone B is the start of an acquisition program. It took us 3 years of talking and debating and hand-wringing between, the Space Force and the intel community to get to the point of actually starting a program. And it doesn't look like it's going that well or moving that quickly.
And that's not even a legislative process, which, we say always slows stuff down. That's just like within the interagency, man.
So I think one of the things the Trump administration could do is settle this fight between the NRO, NGA, and Space Force and whoever else wants to be in that fight. Settle it once and for all. And the way I would settle it is you should both be doing this. We are not a poor country. We can have the intel community building a SAR constellation that's highly resilient and very flexible and usable by tactical commanders in the battlefield. We should also have a Space Force that's doing that. And you know what? At some point in the future, we may want to pick a winner, which system's better. But I'd like to see a little competition for that mission area. And I think the Space Force ought to be competing much more vigorously than they are. Hopefully, they will, whoever the new Secretary of the Air Force is, will stand up for them and actually fight this fight and get the White House on their side.
And didn't you just hear something from the current, soon-to-be former SecAF, Frank Kendall? This morning, he said some things that you tuned into at your old building at CSIS, right?
Yes. I was just watching. Frank Kendall was giving kind of a farewell address. I think it's his last think tank engagement before he leaves office, ending a very long career in public service and service in DOD. What surprised me, though, is his focus of his talk was on his vision for the year 2050 of what the Air Force and the Space Force should be. And his list of things that, he thinks the Space Force, the capabilities he thinks it should have in 2050, what struck me is those are things I think they should have now. And I don't know why he thinks it's going to take 25 years to get to that point.
Can you give us an example? Like which one should we have now as opposed to 50 years from now?
Proliferated resilient missile warning constellation.
No.
I think that's I think that's achievable now. And certainly, the SDA is working that problem. And I think we'll get there within 3 or 4 years to have
at least that's the plan, right?
Right.
I mean, money's been put to this already. Like
either it's a lack of...
Those rockets launched, man.
Yeah. I mean, it's either a lack of vision for what the Space Force really should become in 25 years, or just a lack of confidence that our acquisition system can actually deliver on that. And I mean, he may have good reason to not think that we can do that.
Mutually exclusive.
That's true.
This is not an either or situation.
All right, guys. Listen, we're running out of time, so I'm unable to get to your thoughts on the space economy. Please forgive me, but I do really want to get into your quick take recommendations for, I'd say, 2 very important parts of this ecosystem. We've been talking a lot about the administration, so we've got that covered. But from you, Sarah, I'd really like to know what you would recommend to Congress to do for space and deterrence, and what could be accomplished in the next 100 days. I understand we've focused away and said, oh, well, we need to do this in the next, 2 years or so. But no, these things the foundations get laid now, right? I mean, just as you said, personnel, the administration needs to put in personnel, needs to come up with how they want to, deal with the budget, tweak it, maybe more than tweak it. But I wonder what Congress should be doing in these first 100 days to also create that foundation for the future.
I think it is no surprise that I think passing a final appropriation for 25 is probably the most substantive and real thing that Congress can do to help, frankly, the entire federal government, including the Space Force. So I think figuring that out is top of priority. I think the Senate is going to have a tremendous amount of nominees to push through and think about. The interesting thing on the Hill, especially talking about kind of the space economy and what's going on with kind of commercial space offerings, is there's a lot more cross-jurisdictional things, a lot more cross-jurisdictional issues. And one of the things that we didn't really talk about is mission authorization. Another thing that we didn't talk about that could be dealt with in the first 100 days is looking at export control as it impacts space and space services, right? These are all things that I worked on the House Armed Services Committee. So I, once upon a time ago, was a House rat. I mean, once you're a House rat, you're kind of always a House rat. The great thing about the House is really a place where intellectual ideas kind of come up. It doesn't mean that they're going to get made into law. Most of the time they're not. But it is the powerhouse for presenting new and innovative ideas. And you see those in standalone bills and then standalone authorizations and then a final appropriation and authorization and things like this. And so I think Congress in the first 100 days needs to think about closing out 25, doing their constitutionally derived responsibilities, whether that's on the appropriation side or the nomination side. And I think that in representing their constituents, and I think that they need to do that in a cross-jurisdictional way that really looks for providing a foundation for the space entire ecosystem, not just the national security one. And I think that they've got to do that at a time when what Todd said is exactly right. There needs to be not only a prioritization, but an optimization of alignment, right, between mission and resourcing. And figuring that out, I think, is going to be the real challenge.
And to the both of you, what should the commercial sector do? What should leaders of business, what should investors think about when they're watching this unfold? Because many investors, yes, there is new investment into space, but there's also a lot of dry powder out there, right? And we know they're waiting. So what do they need to take on board right now for these first 100 days? Maybe what should they be looking for? But what should be in their minds?
I mean, my biggest piece of advice to folks in the space industry right now is just deliver on what you're already saying you're going to do. Deliver, move quickly, prove yourself. You don't need to be thinking about the next big thing if you haven't taken the first step yet. Right. And so that's what I'm looking for. And the companies that are consistently delivering capability, they're the ones I think long term are going to succeed.
Sarah, you advise lots of companies all the time. What do you think? What's your take?
Yeah. Deliver on time, on schedule, on cost, and listen to your customers. Right.
Sarah, Todd, thank you both so much for making the time to come on the Downlink podcast.
Glad to do it.
Thanks for having me back.
That's it for this week. For your daily dose of award-winning defense coverage, listen to the Defense and Aerospace Report with Vago Muradian. And for the maritime domain, listen to Cavis Ships with Chris Cavis and Chris Cervello. And get your air domain news and analysis from the Air Power Podcast with JJ Gertler and Vago Muradian. I'm Laura Winter. Thank you for listening.